Pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for making it. So I'm Anthony Castro, CEO of the IAB Tech Lab. For those of you not familiar with the IAB Tech Lab, we were spun out of the IAB about 10 years ago. We have our own board, our own governance, our own funding, our own bylaws, and our remit is to set the global technical standards for the digital advertising industry. What I was going to talk about today was a new framework for addressability that we launched a little bit over a year ago called Seller-Defined Audiences. Actually, it's been almost 2 years since we've launched it, and wanted to really have kind of a primer for how we actually achieve adoption of this framework. But before we get into Seller-Defined Audiences, I think some backstory in the area of privacy, identity, and addressability. Like we as an industry are very clearly at a crossroads. You can't talk about identity or addressability without talking about privacy. You can't talk about privacy without talking about identity and addressability. And this is what we are dealing with as an industry every single day. Europe clearly was at the forefront of this, but it's quickly, the areas of consumer privacy and data security have spread across the globe. So, when we're looking to solve issues of addressability and privacy and identity, you have to look at it holistically. If you look at the legacy approaches that are under threat in our ecosystem, the cookie will be crumbling soon. If we currently adhere to the privacy sandbox timelines, this time next year, the third-party cookie will be no more, so we'll see tremendous signal loss. Furthermore, the IP address is also under threat. As part of the privacy sandbox, the work that Apple's doing and others to obfuscate IP address. And then last but not least, concepts like fingerprinting, of which there is no standard definition of what a fingerprint is. You can think of it as a combination of perhaps deterministic and probabilistic identifiers or signals to create some form of identity graph. That is also at threat as well. So with those legacy approaches to addressability under threat, what does that mean for advertisers? What are some of the key challenges they face? One is targeting. Targeting is going to be a lot more challenging in a world of signal loss that we're entering. Another is frequency capping. How do you frequency cap to create a good ad experience for the consumer? And then last but not least is attribution. I think of targeting and attribution as two sides of the same coin. If you don't have good signal, it's difficult to target, and if you don't have good signal, it's difficult to attribute your ad spend, what actually performed. And there is a tremendous amount of legislation, certainly in the US, that is further impacting some of these challenges we face as an industry. If you look just in the US alone for companies that operate there, you can see there are now 5 privacy laws on the books in the US. There is no federal privacy law in the United States at this time. There are 5 in the books, and next year alone there will be 3 more that are going to go live, and in 2025 we're estimating another 5 to 8 more. So by 2025 you're looking at a massively fragmented US landscape of privacy law, which makes compliance very, very difficult. But it's not just the US. Privacy, what I call privacy fragmentation, is a global issue. As I mentioned, there are other states in the US that are in the process of enacting privacy regulations or have already passed those that will have different dates of effectiveness throughout 24 and 25. But the reach here is much further. India recently enacted a new privacy law, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, or the DPDPA, which rolls off the tongue nicely. The Indian government will be fleshing out exactly what that law is over the course of 2024. As many of you are aware of, the EU's Digital Services Act has gone into effect for VLOPs, very large online platforms, earlier this year, and then they're going to be expanding the enforcement of that in February of next year. And then again, no surprise, as we talked about, Google has started the general available rollout of its Privacy Sandbox APIs to all Chrome users. They will be deprecating the cookie against 1% of all of their users starting in January. So look, Tech Lab sees this, we hear you, we listen to the market, and that's what led to our Project Rearc. So starting in 2018 with the work we did with IAB Europe on TCF 1.0 is really where what we call Project Rearc, and that stands for Project Re-architecture. It's about re-architecting how we as an industry do business, how we as an industry conduct ourselves with a privacy-first approach. So we've clearly been accelerating. The first few years we really spent a lot of time in design work. So some people were questioning by 2021, like, where is this Project Rearc? Where what has been the results of this Project Rearc? Well, we really started to hit our stride in 2021 with the launch of seller-defined audiences in October of 2021, and then as you can see here, we've really accelerated 22 and without question throughout 23. With the global privacy platform that we launched in late 2022, updates to the TCF. We're now up to TCF 2.2. We announced we created clean room standards. We've offered ID solutions guidance, which I've had a lot of conversation today, particularly around ID solutions interoperability. We launched the Privacy Sandbox Task Force. For those of you that are not familiar with the Privacy Sandbox Task Force, as I mentioned, the Privacy Sandbox is Chrome and Android's approach to creating a more private web, but is a radical, radical shift in terms of how this industry actually functions and operates at a fundamental level. We've never seen anything like this before. So we created the task force in September of this year. All Tech Lab members are open to join, and this is where we are analyzing the use cases within the Privacy Sandbox. What current digital advertising use cases are still supported? What are not supported? What are degraded? What is unknown? And the goal of the Privacy Sandbox Task Force is we are going to publish a paper in January for the industry with our assessment of the Privacy Sandbox and the use cases that it still supports and the use cases that it does not support. So that will be coming out towards the end of January. And then certainly most recently we released the data deletion request framework. So for consumers, the ability to access and delete their information across the ad tech supply chain was the design goal of that framework. And that was released about a month ago. And then finally, we'll be releasing the accountability platform to the industry in about 2 weeks. And that is about creating a standard audit mechanism around privacy compliance that can be used by for self-audit, for regulatory audit. How we believe any sort of privacy frameworks or compliance frameworks are paper tigers without some sort of audit function. And this is required. There's components of the GDPR regulation that do require do have some future audit functions, and certainly state of California is one in particular, as well as the state of Connecticut in the US, that are going to require audit functions in the future. So that's where we are today. We're here to talk about seller-defined audiences and hopefully drive adoption of a very innovative approach to really what is almost an ID-less solution. So what are seller-defined audiences? Does anyone want to take a stab in terms of what they are? No? So many have said that seller-defined audiences is the new contextual, like it's a replacement for contextual targeting. You could not be more wrong in that answer. That is not what seller-defined audiences are. So what are they? Seller-defined audiences effectively allow publishers to develop and scale anonymized first-party data sets that can be contextual. That can be email addresses. That could be various other deterministic signals or probabilistic signals that the publisher directly has access to. It's about using their first-party data sets to then create audience segments as defined by the seller in partnership with their buyers, of course. And what does it do? It allows buyers to streamline PMP-level executions against standardized audience cohorts that the publisher defines in partnership with the buyer that Tech Lab can also certify. So we do have a certification program against this. after we released it in 2021, Tech Lab actually won its first award ever. This was not planned. This was not, we didn't formally submit this. Someone else from the industry did. And Adweek, we won the Adweek Reader's Choice of, Best of Tech Partner Awards. So, one of the most innovative developments of the year. And I would agree. But adoption's been kind of slow. So let's talk a little bit about how it works. So as an audience owner, in this case, this would be a publisher media company, they can create audiences based on Tech Lab defined taxonomies and using common data labeling standards. We have datalabel.org, which effectively is kind of a list of raw ingredients that go into creating seller-defined audiences. They then work with their supply chain partners, transmitting this information using the Tech Lab taxonomy over OpenRTB. So we made some modifications to the OpenRTB protocol to support how we can actually pass a seller-defined audience into the bid stream. And then buyers can then target based on the segment and taxonomy information that gets passed within the bid stream. And I'll show you in a moment how that works. So a 101 approach to how seller-defined audiences would work. Step one, create your audiences, and your data sources are, CRM data, contextual data on site, email addresses, whatever you want to put into that stew, if you will, of seller-defined audiences. You then label those audiences using the Tech Lab audience taxonomy, or you can use vendor-specific taxonomies. You don't have to use the Tech Lab taxonomy. You can use proprietary taxonomies. We've got about 30 currently in the GitHub repository that we have recognized as approved vendor-specific taxonomies. You then aggregate those audiences, and there's a little formatting wonkiness here. What you then do is you declare your audiences and the data provenance of those audiences. Does everyone understand the concept of data provenance? Okay, I'll explain it. Data provenance is effectively what is the source of truth that went into the creation of that audience? What were the components? What probabilistic and deterministic signals helped you define those audiences? And this is where that would be signaled. There's a little weird formatting here. That is then passed in the RTB bid stream using what's called the seg tax variable. So data provenance starts with the provider name. So what provider are you using to create these seller-defined audiences? Then there's a taxonomy range as chosen by the audience provider, or you, the publisher, if you're a publisher in the room. And that's passed as the seg tax. And that is tied to a specific taxonomy range, either within the audience taxonomy or a third-party approved vendor taxonomy. And then we pass explicit ID values within that defined taxonomy range that best describe the segmentation. That gets passed in, so this is all passed in the bid request using the seg tax variable. The DSP then parses this and have already done a lookup against the taxonomy range and what audience, what ID values. These are audience values that they can then do a lookup against. And that then goes into determining what they want to bid for that audience. So this mapping already would exist with your DSP partner. Questions? Crystal clear. Yes.
Hold on, please.
Today, which DSP are compliant with SDA?
Any DSP can parse this. So there's no DSP that can't parse this. It's effectively an RTB extension. So almost any major DSP can parse an RTB extension, but you can't just pass it without working with that DSP partner. You need to, when you set up, and I'm going to get into that in a moment, like how do you actually start this process with a DSP? So you would want to inform that you're going to start using seller-defined audiences, and you're going to start passing these variables. And you just need to make them aware that what's the seg tax that you're going to be passing, what audience taxonomy are you using, and then what are the ID values that fall within that taxonomy range. So you just need to have a communication with them, but there's no DSP that can't parse this.
Une autre question. Please introduce yourself. I'm Eric Gellers from Shopper Factory. It's a retail media trading desk. And I have one question. Can we onboard an email address in SDA? Yes?
Yeah. So your audiences can come from any data source. It's not, a lot of people think SDA is contextual. It's not just contextual. Like, it is anything you want to put in there. CRM data, contextual data, email addresses, any first-party data you have access to can go into the creation of this audience.
Okay.
It's all built off your first-party data sets.
Okay, but we need a stack as LiveRamp or ZeoTape to use SDA or not?
No, you can, no.
No?
No, you don't have to. I mean, if you're using a ZeoTap or a LiveRamp or some other ID resolution company, no, this is effectively ID'd less. And the beauty of this for publishers too, it's also very data leakage proof, because there's very little surface area to fingerprint against, or there is effectively not really an ID passed over where they can start to build a profile on that user. I do want to couch that statement. Basic data science 101. With enough entropy, anyone can build a fingerprint or model someone out. With enough effectively data flow over time, and this is just math. This isn't related to our industry. With enough data over time, even if it's relatively obscure over time, someone could start to build a model on someone for sure. But this effectively doesn't have an ID explicitly attached to it, which is one of the beauties of this for publishers. So how do we start the setup to answer your question? So as a publisher, step one is ensure your first-party data is collected and it's sent to exchanges and your DSP partners. Then, working with those DSPs, inform them which taxonomy is going to be used. So again, I think we're up to about 30 different third-party taxonomies that are approved for use. If you're using header bidding with pre-bid, use the first-party data mechanism in pre-bid to make the data available to the bidder adapters. That's how you actually make it available to all the bidder adapters on the publisher side. This was developed in partnership with pre-bid. So they've been very involved in developing this. Then if you're an SSP, what you're doing and working with your publishers is you're consuming and aggregating those audiences across publishers. Even if the audiences from each publishers have the same name, their composition, their data provenance, what went into the definition of that audience segment is very likely to be different, right? So one publisher's definition of a new homeowner could be very different than another publisher's definition of a new homeowner. I may be making a cultural faux pas here, but for example, like ratatouille, I think has kind of wide-ranging definitions of what ratatouille is in French, right? Like, so I've had different forms of ratatouille on French menus when I've been here, but at the end of the day, like, yeah, it's ratatouille. Another analogy would be chili in the US. Like, there's various forms of chili in the US. This is similar. Like, we all call it chili, but the ingredients that went into it could be subtly different. So even if audiences have the same publisher, from each publisher have the same name, their composition is very likely to be different and should be categorized as such. The DSP, when you're working with a DSP to set this up, they should really disable common targeting like matched audience, IP address, and device ID, because that will override, that typically in most DSP setups, override parsing the seg tags and the seller-defined audiences. So any buys against SDA, this should all be turned off. DSPs also need to ignore unintended IDs that accidentally get sent in the bid stream. So sometimes, you may send a UID2 or an ID5, et cetera. Like if you're doing an explicit SDA buy, they need to ignore those identifiers. And then they also need to implement support for buyers to target seller-defined audience signals provided in the bid request. Like they're explicitly targeting that seg tax variable. That's what they're targeting against, which is why you want to disable parsing unintended IDs or other common targeting matched audience information. So there's two approaches to this. There's two implementation approaches. There's an approach when you have a cookieless environment. There's an approach when you have a cookied environment. In the cookieless environment, the SD data, user-level signals are passed to the exchange. The exchange expunges those, and then the SDA data is passed all the way to the DSP, and then the DSP bids against that. So the initial bid request that would go out to the exchange, your SSP partner, would look like this. They then expunge, they can remove things like IP address, would be something that they could actually remove from that. And that by parsing that out, effectively expunging that, again, all they're passing is the seg tax variable, and then the range of IDs that fall within whatever taxonomy has been agreed upon. So at the end of the day, all you're getting is the SDA data. There's no unique user ID pass within this. That's why when I refer to it as ID-less, that's what I mean. And that's also why it is prone to mitigating data leakage for publishers. So it's much more publisher safe from a data perspective. The current challenges with that is that in terms of overall adoption, and that example is that user level signals still exist. IP address is still often passed. There are still cookies. There's UID. If seller-defined audiences is also passed with these, well, then you have now created surface area to actually start to build a user profile, right? So that's one challenge, and we have a remedy for cookied environments or ID'd environments. So some of the other challenges we have in terms of adoption, buyer IDs and IFAs drive higher monetization today than SDA. It's just higher fidelity signal. Buyers will pay a premium for that. And then the primary reason hampering adoption of the SDA is that cookies and IFAs still exist. They're still around, right? So many buyers are like, well, this cookie's still here. I can still hit my client goals using the cookie, so I'm going to continue to use that until those things go away. Solutioning. So how do we use seller-defined audiences without sacrificing identity-driven demand? A couple approaches. You could issue duplicate separate requests, one with seller-defined audiences and no user-level signals, and one with user-level signals and no SDA. The downsides of that are there's higher costs and carbon because you're effectively sending two requests for the same user. And there is a risk of recombining these two things on the back end for a DSP. So that's one approach. You could choose one of these options per request, or you could sufficiently anonymize seller-defined audiences. And the way to do that is to equate a seller-defined audience with a PMP. So how does that work? So in a cookied, what I'm referring to as a cookied environment, or where IDs are still being passed, here's what we're calling, personally identifiable data, or cookies or IDs are still being passed. SDA data still gets passed over, but then work with your exchange partner, and SSPs can do this. The major SSPs can do this. You can map that SDA data to a deal. So now what you're doing is you're taking that seg tax variable, and all you're doing is you're just mapping it to a deal. This PMP represents this seller-defined audience. So all this information has been passed, and at the end of the day, the DSP is just getting a deal. You can still pass the PI data. So if there's a cookie or an ID, you can still pass that. But all they're getting is they're getting something very obfuscated through a deal ID. So this is a solution. This has been tested by a few companies. ShareThrough in the US has run some tests against this to some success. So if you work with ShareThrough, definitely Kurt Larson, who's on Tech Lab's board, has run some of these tests, and he's happy to talk to you more about it. I can talk to you more about this. So consideration and next steps. Which layer obfuscates SDA to deals? It would be the SSP in this case. How do we actually scale deals against SDA? And I think that really becomes a packaging process with you and your SSP partners. The intermediaries, your SSPs, effectively, should build the ability to use SDA signals for exchange package deals. Most major SSPs can do this today. Market those deals to buyers, right? And then publishers build your user data. I can't encourage that enough. We do have a data transparency compliance program. So we do have a data transparency standard which establishes data provenance. We validate how old the data is. Is it still fresh? To what extent was the data manipulated or modeled? What are the qualifying business criteria to actually segment the data? And then when you have segmented the data, how is it we then evaluate it for comparability against other segments. So example, if we were looking at two definitions of homeowners, what actually is a valid definition of the homeowner? So not only can this be used for seller-defined audiences, some of the meetings I've had today were questions around data provenance and data data transparency. We can do this for really any form of ID or data provider. We can run them through this compliance program. So what should you do as a buyer? Talk to your tech partners about their plans for seller-defined audience. Do they have pilots running? There are a handful of DSPs out there that do have some pilots running. Do they have the features to effectively support seller-defined audiences? The major DSPs can parse this information. They do. If you're working with a DSP that doesn't, ask them if they actually plan to build that. Here are some resources on our full specification. These QR codes do work. And then this is the most recent implementation guide that we released. We released this in October of this year. So I'll leave it up there for a minute. And if you guys want to, I'll get out of your way. And we're going to distribute this presentation. Yeah, so you're all going to get a copy of the presentation as well. So the links are also fully functional. That's it.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this presentation. So we are moving from one-to-one targeting to few-to-few targeting. That's the future.
Well, I think the future of targeting in our industry is going to be cohort and lookalike models based off of high-fidelity seed data. Like, not everyone's going to opt out. So I think that's where the industry goes. I think data in the aggregate, and we've talked to some DPAs, both here in Europe as well as authorities in the US. Anonymized data in the aggregate is where the comfort zone is for government regulators. Generally speaking, that's a general statement, not every single one, but generally speaking, that's where I think we're headed.
Okay, anyway, IAB Tech Lab will be here to help brands and also market to understand what will be the future. Thank you once again to be here today. Thank you very much. Vous pouvez l'applaudir une dernière fois. Thank you.